Picture this. It's 1851 down in the American South.
Right.
And there's this prominent physician, and he's looking at enslaved people who are risking their lives, braving dogs, armed patrols, I mean, everything just to escape captivity.
Yeah.
And this doctor, using the full authority of his medical degree, publishes a paper declaring that these people are not, reacting to horrific oppression. Instead, he diagnoses them with a psychiatric illness.
He literally medicalizes the desire for freedom.
Exactly. He calls it a biological disease that needs to be cured.
It is, honestly, one of the most chilling examples in our source stack today. That doctor was Samuel Cartwright.
Right.
And he named his fabricated disease drapetomania. I mean, he basically took the raw brutality of human prejudice and dressed it up in a lab coat.
He used the supposed objectivity of medicine to justify an atrocity.
Yes.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because today, our mission on this deep dive is to explore a massive, incredibly heavy stack of historical and modern sources covering what is known as scientific racism.
And it is a heavy stack.
It really is. We're going to look at how the objective veneer of science was historically hijacked to build artificial human hierarchies. And more importantly, how you, the person listening to this right now, how you can still spot the echoes of this pseudoscience today.
Because it's still out there.
Exactly. Whether you are scrolling through a newsfeed, reading a medical journal, or just trying to make sense of modern data, understanding how statistics and biology can be manipulated is what's the ultimate tool for critical thinking. Think of science like a mirror.
Okay, a mirror.
Right. We think it reflects objective reality, but sometimes it only reflects the biases of the person holding it.
That is a great way to look at it. To set our foundation from the sources and, try to visualize this against a backdrop of shifting historical texts and modern DNA helixes scientific racism is essentially the pseudoscientific belief that you can use hard empirical data to prove some groups of humans are biologically distinct.
Distinct and hierarchical, like ranked.
Exactly. Ranked into taxa. It is taking cultural biases and formalizing them into biological taxonomy. Now, modern scientific consensus completely rejects this.
Of course.
Like the 1950 UNESCO statement formally denounced it. But we really have to understand from the 1600s all the way through World War II, this wasn't some fringe theory.
It was the norm.
It was mainstream, heavily funded, completely accepted science.
So to understand how data gets manipulated today, in the 2020s, we have to go back to how humans first started classifying each other. We have to look at the Enlightenment.
Right, the age of reason.
Yeah, humanity suddenly had this desperate need to categorize the expanding natural world. But they brought all their cultural baggage with them right to the microscope.
They really did. The Enlightenment brought this massive weight of scientific classification, but you cannot separate the science from the society that's funding it. Take François Bernier, for example.
The French physician.
Right. In 1684, he published an essay attempting to divide all of humanity into 4 distinct races.
Wait, so a French physician in the 1600s is just looking at a globe and deciding where the biological lines are drawn.
Basically, yes.
What was he actually basing this on? Did he have any sort of empirical metric at all?
Not really. He was basing it almost entirely on geography and his own highly subjective ideas of female beauty.
Wow. Seriously?
Yes. He put Europeans in the first race, which he clearly viewed as the baseline, the norm. And by contrast, he notoriously described the Sami people of Northern Europe as awful and, quote, reminiscent of a bear's face.
Reminiscent of a bear's face. That's just wild.
It was purely observational prejudice disguised as early taxonomy. He was observing cultural and aesthetic differences and just declaring them to be deep biological divides.
Which brings a much bigger name into our source stack, Carl Linnaeus.
Oh, yes, the father of modern taxonomy.
Right, the guy who gave us the system of naming species that we still use today. Kingdom, phylum, class, order.
That's the one. In his 1767 edition of Systema Naturae, Linnaeus didn't just classify plants and animals, he turned his gaze to humans.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, but he didn't stop at categorizing physical traits like skin color or genography. He assigned highly subjective moral behaviors to his categories.
Like personality traits?
Exactly. He claimed Europeanness was gentle, acute, inventive, and governed by customs. Meanwhile, Africanus was described as sly, lazy, negligent, and governed by caprice.
That is just blatant stereotyping.
He even threw in a category called Homo monstrosus for mythical creatures and, feral men.
Wait, so the father of modern taxonomy was just baking flat-out behavioral stereotypes into the permanent scientific record. Did anyone in the scientific community push back on this at the time? I mean, someone had to say something.
Well, this raises an important question, and it's heavily debated in our modern sources.
Okay.
Some critics, like the scholar Marie-Christine Cinca, argue Linnaeus was merely Eurocentric.
Nearly Eurocentric.
Right. She suggests his focus was on culture rather than inherent biology, noting he didn't even use the word race himself. But other historians, like Renato Mazzolini, argue that regardless of his exact conscious intent, this white-black polarity that Linnaeus codified, it became the absolute paradigm for later racist beliefs.
Because it set the standard.
Exactly. He essentially built the scaffolding for a biological hierarchy.
And the lengths people went to justify these new categories is just crazy. I mean, looking at the stack, our sources mention American founding father Dr. Benjamin Rush.
Oh, Dr. Rush. Yes.
He was a highly respected physician, but he genuinely believed that black skin was actually a form of hereditary leprosy.
He called it Negroidism.
Negroidism. He thought it was a curable skin disease.
And the bizarre thing is, because he viewed it as a disease, Rush thought he was actually being highly progressive.
Wait, what? Progressive how?
He argued that non-white people shouldn't be tyrannized or enslaved because they were simply, quote, diseased and could potentially be cured.
Meaning turned white.
Meaning turned white underneath. It perfectly illustrates how desperate early scientists were to maintain a European biological default.
That is fascinating.
They were trying to cram the vast, complex reality of human diversity into an incredibly narrow, biased worldview.
So once Linnaeus and others built these categorical boxes, society needed a way to prove who belonged in which box. And more importantly, who was at the top.
Right, because you can't rank things objectively without data.
Exactly. That demand for proof birthed physical anthropology, and specifically, the absolute obsession with measuring the unmeasurable.
Subjective observation morphed into the illusion of hard data through craniometry.
Measuring skulls.
Measuring skull to determine intelligence. We see Peter Camper's facial angle theories, and then in the 19th century, Dr. Samuel George Morton, he collected skulls from all over the world.
To measure the brain size.
Yes. He started measuring their interior volume by filling them with lead shot or mustard seed, assuming that a bigger skull meant a bigger brain, which automatically equated to higher intelligence.
I think we can all see where this is going. It's like grading a test, where you already decided who's going to get an A and who's going to get an F before you even look at the answers.
That is exactly what he did. Morton claimed Caucasian brains had the largest volume, averaging 87 cubic inches. Native Americans were at 82, and Negroes had the smallest at 78 cubic inches.
Just assigning neat little numbers to it.
He used this specific numerical data to argue that the races had been separate and unequal since the very beginning of human history.
What's really fascinating to me in the stack is how modern scientists look back at Morton's numbers today.
Oh, the data debate.
Yeah, because for a long time, the famous evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould argued that Morton deliberately falsified his data.
Right. Gould claimed Morton subconsciously packed the Caucasian skulls tighter with seed to make them measure larger.
But later anthropologists completely upended that theory.
What's fascinating here is that anthropologists like Jason Lewis and John Michael physically remeasured Morton's smell collection.
Okay.
And they found that Morton's physical data was actually quite accurate.
Really?
Yes, he didn't physically fudge the numbers. The cubic inches were correct. But his conclusions were entirely racist and scientifically invalid.
Wait, how does that work? If the measurements were physically accurate, how is the science completely wrong?
Because modern science demonstrates that human variation is continuous, not discrete. Morton forced continuous human diversity into rigid, artificial categories.
Oh, I see. Think of human variation like a rainbow.
Okay.
It's a continuous, fluid spectrum of color. Morton essentially walked up to that beautiful, continuous rainbow with 3 buckets of paint, red, blue, and yellow, and forced every single subtle shade into one of those 3 buckets.
Completely ignoring the blending in between.
Exactly. His math on how much paint was in the bucket was right, but the buckets themselves were a total fiction.
That is the perfect way to visualize it.
Yep.
He decided the boxes existed, sorted the skulls into them based on his own cultural biases, and then used the mathematical averages of those artificial boxes to, quote, prove a hierarchy.
So the arithmetic was flawless, but the biological premise was a complete fabrication. And once you have scientific proof of a hierarchy from people like Morton, you can start medicalizing anything that threatens that hierarchy. Which brings us right back to our intro. Dr. Cartwright in 1851 diagnosing fleeing enslaved people with drapetomania.
Cartwright used the prevailing science of the day to argue that specific groups were biologically designed for subservience. Therefore, any resistance to that subservience couldn't be a rational human desire for freedom.
It had to be diagnosed as a pathology.
Exactly. And his prescribed medical treatment for this illness was, quote, proper medical advice.
Which meant what, exactly?
In practice, it meant physical abuse, whipping, and forced submission.
God. So what does this all mean? If science can prove hierarchy through skull measurements and diagnose resistance as a mental illness, it inevitably becomes a tool for state power.
It absolutely scales up, from the plantation to global policy.
And we see this shift explicitly in the 1920s in the United States with the dawn of IQ testing.
It becomes a literal mechanism for social engineering. Henry Goddard started applying early intelligence tests to immigrants arriving at Ellis Island.
Claiming to objectively measure their innate cognitive ability.
Right.
But think about the mechanics of this. You have immigrants arriving after a grueling multi-week boat ride. They likely don't speak English. They are exhausted, scared, and in a completely foreign environment.
Yeah.
And Goddard hands them a puzzle or a test that relies heavily on American cultural context. It wasn't testing innate intelligence, it was testing their proximity to American culture.
Yet, based on these heavily biased tests, Goddard published data claiming that vast majorities of Jewish, Italian, and Russian immigrants were, quote, feeble-minded.
And this wasn't just an academic exercise filed away in a library somewhere.
No, this data directly influenced lawmakers. It provided the supposedly objective foundation for the Immigration Act of 1924, which imposed strict racial and national quotas to block undesirable people from entering the country.
The science gave lawmakers the perfect cover. It allowed them to say, hey, this isn't prejudice. This is public health. We are just protecting the nation's intelligence.
Exactly.
And our sources show this exact same weaponization happening globally. Look at the origins of apartheid in South Africa.
Oh, absolutely. The Carnegie Commission on the Poor White Problem in South Africa published a massive 5-volume report in the early 1930s.
And the context here is vital, right?
Extremely vital. The global economic depression was hitting South Africa hard, and poor white populations were suffering right alongside Black Native populations.
Which completely broke the visual hierarchy of white supremacy.
Yes.
If white people were intrinsically biologically superior, they shouldn't be starving in the same slums as the people they were oppressing. It caused a massive panic among the ruling class.
The Carnegie Report explicitly expressed fear that poor whites would not be able to resist the process of what they called Africanization.
So they needed a structural way to separate the populations.
Okay. To protect the myth of white superiority, this fear-driven pseudoscientific report played a key role in providing the intellectual and sociological groundwork for establishing the brutal legal segregation system of apartheid.
Which all culminates in eugenics, the incredibly dangerous idea that you can selectively breed humanity to preserve the superior traits and physically eliminate the inferior ones.
You see this momentum building with Madison Grant, an American eugenicist who wrote The Passing of the Great Race in 1916. He championed the preservation of the Nordic race.
And you see it in Sweden, too.
Yes, Sweden opened the world's first government-funded state institute for racial biology in 1922. Aiming to cure criminality and alcoholism through racial hygiene.
And we all know where this ideology ultimately leads. Nazi Germany weaponized these exact American and European texts.
They took the theories of eugenics and pushed them to their absolute horrific logical conclusion. They used these models to legally justify compulsory sterilization and ultimately the Holocaust.
Targeting Jewish people, the disabled, homosexual.
Anyone the state deemed Lebenswertes Leben life unworthy of life.
There is a deeply dark irony in the sources regarding the Nazis and this supposedly objective data. Hitler actually banned IQ testing in Germany.
He did.
He deemed IQ testing to be Jewish because the results didn't always align with his preconceived racial hierarchies. It just proves that the science was always subservient to the ideology. The moment the tool didn't perfectly validate the prejudice, the tool was discarded.
Following the horrors of World War II and the revelations of the Nuremberg trials, The global scientific community had a massive public reckoning.
Mainstream science formally denounced scientific racism.
Right. The 1950 UNESCO statement was a vital turning point. It brought together geneticists, anthropologists, sociologists to clearly separate the biological myth of race from the very real social reality of racism.
And today, modern genetic consensus is crystal clear on this. The 2019 JANA Declaration, published by the German Zoological Society, definitively states that the biological concept of distinct human races is simply invalid.
They proved through modern sequencing that genetic variation is actually smaller between human populations than within them.
Meaning, there is more genetic difference between two random people living in the same town in Germany than there is between the average genetic makeup of Europe and Asia.
Exactly. The categories Linnaeus and Bernier dreamed up simply do not exist at a genetic level.
But if the scientific consensus is so definitive, why does our source stack include events from the 2020s?
Because the underlying human desire to justify inequality didn't disappear, it just adapted to the times.
It put on a modern lab coat.
Yes, we are seeing a modern fringe movement attempting to resurrect these hierarchical ideas using manipulated statistics and genomic vocabulary.
Like Arthur Jensen or Richard Lynn, who were heavily critiqued in our sources, Lynn actually published papers trying to claim that a nation's GDP is biologically determined by its national average IQ.
He even tried to tie intelligence to the proportion of Caucasian genes in African Americans.
Yeah.
But mainstream scientists point out that Lynn's methodology is deeply flawed. He routinely commits one of the cardinal sins of data analysis.
Confusing correlation with causation.
Exactly. He attributes complex societal outcomes solely to genetics, completely ignoring massive social, economic, historical, and environmental variables.
Now, it's fascinating to see how this historical debate bleeds right into modern politics. Looking at the stack of sources provided to us, we see conflicting views playing out in real time.
Very much so.
And as a quick reminder to you listening, we explicitly do not take sides on this show. We strictly impartially report what is in the source material, even when it's politically charged.
Right, just presenting the text.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, for example, the sources note a March 27, 2025 White House executive order. It characterized a Smithsonian exhibit on African American art as divisive, specifically objecting to the exhibit's presentation of race as a social construct rather than a biological reality.
And on the other side of that debate, in our sources, we have scholars like Henry Louis Gates Jr.
Right.
He points out that human genetic diversity actually unifies us because, quote, we are all mixed.
It really highlights how the definition of race remains a highly charged, active debate in the public sphere today, even with the genetic consensus settled.
It illustrates that the tension between cultural identity and biological science is still incredibly potent. But the sources point to something even more concerning than political debates.
The active modern manipulation of hard scientific data by fringe groups.
Yes.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We are looking at a major New York Times report from January 24, 2026. This isn't historical theory. This is a modern data breach.
The report revealed that a group of fringe researchers, including Brian Pesta and Emil Kierkegaard, who, by the way, were funded in part by the Pioneer Fund.
Which is an organization with a long history of supporting scientific racism.
Right. They used outright deception to access protected data from the National Institutes of Health.
They infiltrated the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. How did they actually pull that off?
They applied for access by claiming they were conducting standard, benign sociological research. But once they got their hands on that protected genetic and personal data, they ran deeply flawed statistical regressions.
Flawed how?
They deliberately isolated race as a variable while minimizing or stripping out socioeconomic status, school quality, and environmental factors. They used this manipulated analysis to publish at least 16 papers purporting to find biological evidence for differences in intelligence between races.
So they were essentially suggesting that black people earn less because they are biologically less smart, rather than acknowledging systemic economic barriers.
Yes.
It's like money laundering, but for data.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, you take biased, counterfeit science, and you pass it through a clean, highly respected institution like the NIH. Once it comes out the other side, the public sees the NIH association and accepts the counterfeit data as valid currency.
Even though mainstream geneticists immediately rejected their methodology as biased and unscientific,
But the damage was already done.
by laundering their racist theories through a prominent data set, they gave their work an air of analytical rigor. It sparked a massive wave of online disinformation. People shared these papers on social media claiming, look, the NIH data proves it.
It is the exact same playbook as Samuel Morton filling skulls with mustard seed, just updated for the age of big data and algorithmic sequencing.
It really is.
Which brings us to the core of this deep dive. For you listening, we've traveled a massive distance today. We went from Francois Bernier looking at a map and deciding who was beautiful in the 1600s to Linnaeus inventing behavioral categories,
We saw Dr. Cartwright diagnosing runaway enslaved people with a mental illness.
and Henry Goddard designing puzzles to keep immigrants out of America. We've seen how this illusion of hard data fed state-sponsored eugenics all the way to modern fringe groups laundering manipulated statistics through the NIH in 2026.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the absolute key takeaway from our sources is that data never, ever exists in a vacuum. As the scholar Jonathan Marks notes in the text, science doesn't become racist on its own. It is racist ideas propagated by scientists that make science racist. We have to relentlessly interrogate not just the numbers on the page, but the assumptions, the funding, and the cultural biases of the people designing the studies.
Because the legacy of this isn't just an academic history lesson.
Yeah.
I mean, Harriet Washington's phenomenal book, Medical Apartheid, which anchors much of this stack, shows how this history of medical racism directly impacts the massive lack of trust in the medical system today.
Where marginalized people were viewed as biologically different and exploited for experiments.
Exactly. When a community has historically been diagnosed with fake diseases to keep them enslaved or sterilized by state biology institutes, that generational memory doesn't just vanish. The past is still in the exam room with us today.
The categories we create and the data we manipulate to justify them have very real, generational, and often lethal consequences. It demands constant vigilance.
And that leads me to a final thought I want to leave you with today, something to really mull over as you consume data this week. Today, we are outsourcing more and more of our decision-making, our sorting, and our categorization to artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms.
We use them for everything.
Hiring, medical diagnoses, loan approvals, criminal justice risk assessments.
We are training machines to look at the massive, chaotic world and categorize it for us.
Assuming the machine will finally give us that perfectly clean, objective mirror.
Right.
But if the greatest, most celebrated scientific minds of the past could unknowingly bake their deepest, most horrific prejudices into what they completely believed was objective data, what biases are we currently programming into the AI systems of our future without even realizing it? We think we're building an impartial intelligence, but if we aren't careful about the data we feed it, we might just be automating the exact same distorted hierarchies we've been fighting for centuries.